This is the second video lecture on the topic of early adulthood. We ended the first lecture talking about stress and more or less defining it. I want to pick up this lecture and continue on that conversation of stress. And the reason we're talking about it in this chapter is because there's lots going on in our lives during this period. Lots of decisions to be made, lots of new changes. And so to understand, what we may be feeling, if this is feeling like a difficult time, this is perfectly logical or perfectly reasonable. So understand so our textbook uses the language of origins of stressors. What I appreciate about the way both this textbook and the one in the psychology class talk about is this notion that stress is a matter of interpretation. Well, let me explain. There are demands, like things like getting a job, moving into an apartment, having or doing final exams when you're quarantined. Those are not your imagination, but the way that we define or the way that we appraise, and that's the word that your textbook uses. It talks about the appraisal. So cognitive appraisal, remembering that cognitive is thinking, and how we think about situations is critical to how we manage or how we cope with the stress, with these demands that are upon us during this period in our life. Right. So the first one is what's referred to as the primary appraisal. So do you define these things that are expected of you? Do you define them as good or bad? Is it good or bad to get a job versus losing a job, right? And if we can interpret these or appraise these events from the perspective of they are good as opposed to bad, this can help us with coping. And certainly losing a job is obviously bad. I don't know, obviously bad. Maybe it was a job you didn't like in the first place. And if we can interpret things from the perspective of, I didn't really like that job, this gives me an opportunity to find a better job. Or, during this time, people can interpret these expectations, these demands to stay at home. We can interpret these as we are isolated and alone, or we can appraise them, we can think about them cognitively as this is a great opportunity for me to take a break, to learn something new, to read these books that I haven't had time. So that's what we mean by primary appraisal. Can we define whatever is expected of us as good or bad? Secondary appraisal, and this is another really important one, is can I handle it? In other words, do I have the emotional, the cognitive, the spiritual, the financial resources to deal with what is expected of me? And this is where coping with stress is critical, because if I define a situation as beyond my control, it's going to be much more stressful to me than if I say, I've done this before, or I got this. Around my neighborhood, I see a lot of signs and they say, you got this, you can handle it. And that's all about this. Do I have the resources? When we say to ourselves, I can get through this, or we can get, you see this all the time. I think it's a little corny, I must admit, but you see it on the TV, we're in this together. And I think that's kind of cheesy because of course we're in this together, whatever. But the idea is that the message is you have the resources to deal with these expectations, these stressful expectations. So that's what we mean by the secondary appraisal. Do you have the resources? Can you handle the situation? And when we can say, this is good, I can do this, those are coping strategies for dealing with stress. And then there's a discussion in your book about temperamental differences. And you remember back when we were talking about children, small children, and temperament. And one of the ways to think about temperament is can you handle changes? So if your temperament is one where you don't like change, and here are these expectations of a lot of change, this might be more difficult for you than if your temperament is one where you adjust quite quickly to change. And we can cognitively interpret these expectations. One of the things my mom used to always say is another adventure or another chapter in the book. And she always framed her life from the metaphor of it was a book, and she was writing a book. So some chapters were more interesting than other chapters, but that was how she coped with stress, right? Sometimes events are completely uncontrollable and we can't do anything about them. So how we cognitively interpret those things, things that are harder or are less clear. So this, for some people, this is a very ambiguous, it's not clear what's happening. We don't know when we're going. Some of the people that I'm working with, that I work with at the Goodwill, they're posting on Facebook. They're really stressed out right now because they don't understand what's going on. It's not clear, and they don't know when they can return to their work. So for them, it's very ambiguous, and that ambiguousness is causing them a lot of stress. I myself have sort of interpreted it as, cognitively appraised it as, it's good, I've got other things to do, don't really want to go back right now, I would rather stay, anyway. Okay, so, and then the third, ambiguous or clear, negative or positive, controllable or non-controllable. And then another important component of how we cope is, are there lots of things being asked of me, or is this just one thing? I'm going to refer to this, to this quarantine phenomena, because that's something we're all in this together, right? We're all sharing. But in the beginning, it was more stressful because it seemed to me that every time you turn on the news, there was something new, and the things were changing so quickly. Like first, we have this extended spring break. Then the universities aren't going to, resume face to face. Then the public schools are closed. Then the store went on furlough. Then, all these other events were just canceled. Bing, bang, boom. And it just felt like it was just constant adjustment. So that can be harder for people if it's many things, or if they just have to deal with one thing is different in their life, right? So it's also why they say, for kids, if there's a divorce or a death, that you should limit the life-changing events. So like if there's a death, they say don't move right away, right? Deal with that change and don't compound it, don't make it more stressful by moving to another place. That's an additional, potentially unnecessary, stress. Okay, so then we get to coping, right? Coping is, again, how you deal with it, how you respond to these stress. And there's basically two kinds of ways of coping. We have what's referred to as problem-based coping, and the other is referred to as emotional-based coping. And again, if we define coping as the effort to control the effects of the stress, problem-based coping is what my mother does. My mother tries to fix everybody's problems, right? Problem-based coping is also more likely, like men are more likely to rely on problem-based coping. You tell them a problem, they want to solve it, right? They try to fix it. So problem-based coping would be, let's say you're stressed out about your homework. So somebody who is problem-based coping would make lists and they would start to study. That's how they deal with the effect of the stress. And that's useful when we are dealing with stresses that can be addressed, that you can change something, you can fix them. Another approach to stress is what's referred to as emotional focus. Sometimes you can't do anything about it, right? So like what's happening right now, if your job is furloughed or laid off, you can't really do anything about that, right? So you can't go out necessarily and find a new job because there are no jobs to find. Or if a loved one is dying from cancer, you can't make that cancer go away. You can't fix that problem. And instead, we use what's referred to as emotional focus coping. And emotional focus coping is when we deal with things, we we reinterpret, really all we can do is reinterpret that event, and that will then change the way that we emotionally feel or emotionally respond. Emotional focus coping. This is where faith communities can be really useful because they help us reinterpret, or friends or support groups. All of those things can help us reinterpret events so that we can have a different emotional response. Defensive coping, right? So this is not a useful strategy at all, and this is where we may deny. I would argue that you could probably, defensive coping would probably also be like um, intoxication, right? Staying drunk, or staying high or something, so you can deny it's going on or completely ignoring it. That is a form of coping. That's a legit form of coping. It is not a healthy one and not a productive one. And so again, it depends on what the situation is, what options you have for both of them, for whichever. Yeah. Anyway, and then finally, a couple characteristics, and I think I asked my psychology students to do this. I'm not sure if I'm going to ask you to do this or not, but it's referred to as hardiness. And hardiness is a concept, is a way of thinking about how well you deal with stress, right? If hardy people are people that have resources, that have strategies, that can adapt to stress in a healthy way. And often that's defined. So some of the characteristics of hardiness are a group of confidence or confidants, a circle of friends that you can share your feelings or your concerns with. People who have a faith community, that's also a measure of hardiness, because a faith community can help you redefine things emotionally. They can also help you with problem focused coping. And then, another way of thinking about it is resilience. And resilience is the idea that when you're in a stressful situation and it requires a lot of resources, that you are able to bounce back. I guess those are kind of sort of the same thing, yeah. But resilience is your ability to, what's your textbook say, ability to withstand, overcome, or even thrive. And this would be I'm curious to see what the researchers are going to tell us about this time, because certainly there are some folks who are doing very well under quarantine. And so what will be interesting is what the psychologists learn about personality characteristics, resiliency, and hardiness. And those people who are doing well right now as they're quarantined, how are their personality traits different than those folks who are not doing so well, right? So that's what we mean by hardiness and resiliency. I'm going to stop this second video here, and when we come back, I want to talk about cognitive development during young adulthood and why that is a great time to go into higher education, because your brain is just it's just ripe for talking about ideas.